Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It's like the Barry Manilow song. Looks like we made it here. 3:30. Yeah, that's right. I made a Barry Manilow reference. I'm Nick Rathel, Chief Operating Officer for the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, also known as the Bay Area Toll Authority. And I have a little bit of a story to tell you. So when I was asked to moderate this session, I got really excited. This is Seattle. And when I think about Seattle, I think about a movie. Follow me. Maybe you know what the movie is. It's a love story. It's about a very specific technology. And a lot of it was shot right here in the greater Seattle area. Now, what movie could that be? That's right, War Games. War Games. So for those of you not familiar, War Games was a movie starring a much younger Matthew Broderick and Ali Sheedy. It followed a storyline where Matthew Broderick played a high school amateur computer hacker who found his way into a video game server. Now, this guy hit the adolescent gold rush. I mean, it was a gold mine for this kid. It was the newest, greatest video game that was coming out, and he had gotten into that system. Now, what he really had 24 baud modem his way into was a top secret U.S. government server. It was actually a system. That's right, the Whopper. So the Whopper was actually a system created in the movie for the U.S. government that was able to learn from itself, and it was able to improve itself. Therefore, it couldn't be solved, or it couldn't be stopped. But what it could do is it could take the human element out of making nuclear war decisions. Very important back then. Big policy thing. So he does this, and things escalate, and the U.S. goes on high alert, top level alert, because oh my God, there are missiles, long-range missiles coming from Russia attacking the United States. Well, the good news is, like any good Broderick and Sheedy movie from the 80s, everything turns out okay. It was truly a simulation. It was only a game. But it was interesting because there's a concept there of a machine being able to learn from itself and to improve itself. Sound familiar? That movie came out 40 years ago this past summer. Yeah, I know. 40 years ago this past summer. And it was somewhat prophetic. The primary part of the movie, or the primary message of the movie, was about the idea of mutually assured destruction in the case of nuclear war. But it was the secondary message that a machine was actually learning from itself that was actually the hidden in plain sight prophecy of that film. Now, the good news today, we're going to talk about something way less dubious as far as AI. This is going to get a lot lighter. I'm excited to have come to the stage Jeremy Kirshbaum. So Jeremy is a venture builder and strategist who has been working with clients to understand, plan, and implement generative AI projects since 2019. That's a long time in this industry. He founded the innovation consultancy Handshake, alongside his work with Fortune 500 executive teams, governments, and non-government organizations. He's building the Library of Babel platform for collaborative large language model exploration. Ladies and gentlemen, give it up for Jeremy Kirshbaum.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thanks for being here today. I'm very excited to be here with you today to talk about this topic. I love it very much, and I think it's critical right now because we are in an important part of history. Soon, with AI, we may solve the deepest questions of humankind and the universe, such as, What if Ghostbusters was all cats? What a time to be alive. This is by my friend Dylan Hendricks at Institute for the Future. He's also a wonderful futures researcher. You should check him out. And he was exploring this topic for us. I want to go deep with you on generative AI today and how to think about it at a high level and what it might mean for us and our organizations, both practically and maybe a little bit philosophically. But before we dive into that, I want to get a little bit of a sense of how people are feeling about this in the room. Different rooms feel differently. So we'll do a little bit of a Slido in just a moment. But what we're going to talk about today is, how do you want to be augmented? And I use the word augmentation carefully instead of automation or artificial intelligence. I think that thinking about how you want to be extended and how you want to be amplified is kind of the key to all this. And if you can hone in on that, then the rest of this actually becomes quite easy. But I want to know where you're at first. So if you can open up your phones, if we could get the Slido up on the screen. All right, we'll start thinking about it. The question is going to be, how optimistic or pessimistic do you feel about generative AI? So 1 star is completely pessimistic. I think it's going to go terribly. It's going to be the apocalypse. Humans are going to be wandering around with nothing to do, no money, hoping that robots will give them a job labeling something. Or 5 stars is totally optimistic. This is the end of, hunger. It's going to solve all our problems. It's going to solve climate change, et cetera, et cetera. All right. I don't know if you're flipping me off or you're just a nice normal curve there, but that's a good start. Okay, great. So we have a lot of people that are kind of in the middle. Maybe a balanced view, a couple of people in the extremes. Wow, very balanced. That's interesting. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. I want to get a little bit deeper with you. Obviously, it's a big room, so we can't all go around and give our full TED Talk. That's just for me today. But if you could give me one word, if we could get the next Slido pull up, one word that describes your feeling towards generative AI. So, for example, annoyed. Skynet, skeptical. Curious, very curious. Hopeful. Hopeful and curious. Great. Concerned. This is kind of interesting. In general, the words are more positive than the original optimism pessimism poll was. Okay. Skeptical, uninformed, hesitant, nuclear holocaust. That was your opening, Nick, influencing. Okay, great. Thank you. How we think about this is important for how we approach the next decade of building this, how we shape our organizations around this, and how we, in fact, approach it. And I personally think that there's a lot to be concerned about. My word, if I had put one up there, would have been concerned. I got into this because I, in 2019, was doing more broadly innovation consulting, and I realized that what I was doing would be automated. I run a company called Handshake. We do generative AI. We do generative AI research, looking into new ways of using this and applying it. We come up with new generative products and features that are ahead of the curve for our clients and for ourselves. We then help people build these things and get down in the trenches with them. And we do training so that people are aware of what's coming and how they can help themselves and their organization thrive with this technology. We do this all over the world, and we do it mostly by doing. We learn a lot from the desktop research, and that's really important, and working with people and organizations is too, but getting down in the weeds, doing some really boring, interesting, the most boring is the most interesting sometimes, things like topic modeling for SMS survey data. Sometimes we get to do more interesting stuff like bringing authors' books to life. We'll talk a little bit about some of those projects today. But the point is, This is how we surface insights for people, is by setting up these systems and finding out in a deep way what they can and can't do. We do this on many across continents. We've been spending a lot of time in China, for instance. This is just a simple picture of the subways in Shanghai, which are covered with billboards with AI-generated images on them now. They're building all kinds of different models on-prem, off-prem, in the cloud, a lot of stuff inside of organizations, within enterprises. There's there's a whole entire presentation to be made about generative AI in China, but it's something you should be looking into. We also work with International Rescue Committee, applying generative AI to EdTech in Nigeria. This is a global phenomenon. Although most of us here are based in the US or Europe, this is something where disruption can really come from anywhere. And the spread has been flatter than anything I've ever seen. There was many young Nigerians that I work with that were adopting this back in 2020, already applying it to their work because it was free and easy to use and made their work better. And so the way that this is spreading is just completely unlike any other technology I've tracked before. So let's talk about where this is going. Where is it today? And then try and think a little bit about what should we do about it? What does that mean for us? The things coming out today, to me, seem totally extraordinary. Back in 2019, I was able to get GPT-2 to kind of write some ideas for me, or maybe like write a poem or a science fiction story. Now, for instance, a company called Runway has a model out where you can apply consistent styles across videos very easily using just an image and some words. This came out, and then only about 6 months later, they came out with a new version of the model where you could literally just type something in, and it generates a video. It's about 15 seconds long, and the videos are, well, you could call them artistic or bad, depending on your framing, but they're getting better and better all the time. In fact, video generation, not just text generation, not just image generation, video generation is getting good enough that just in the last week, a company, an autonomous driving company, released a model called Gaia 1 that is exclusively for creating training data for their autonomous vehicles. So this is a model that they use to generate video of what they call corner cases, a video that they don't have. So maybe they have video training data of a pedestrian crossing the street. Maybe they have a road in the fog, but they don't have a pedestrian crossing the street in the fog. And so they use this in order to generate a video of that and then train the AI. So the data being generated by these algorithms has gotten good enough that we are now training other AIs on it to achieve stuff. But you're being blasted with new amazing stuff about this all the time, every week, right? So let's try and dig down on why all this is happening now. What is going on now? What happened that we're starting to see all this pop up? The reality is that a lot of the math from these AI models has been around since the 50s and 60s. And what changed was that was video games. Video games demanded better and better graphics, and so they started making chips to make better and better graphics for video games. Just so happened to be the same kind of math that you need for AI models. And because of this, we've been able to create these models called a transformer. This isn't super important, I just think it's kind of interesting, but some points that I think are important about this are that they need a lot of data, like a lot, like the size of the internet, a lot. And once you have the data, you need a lot of computing power. But, and this is the critical part, if you have a ton of data, even if it's messy, you can get better results just by scaling up. And people had speculated about this, but they didn't really know. And then OpenAI, because they were a nonprofit and at the time didn't need to make money, took a bet on it with GPT-2 and then went way farther with GPT-3, and the rest is history. And so now you're seeing people replicate this over and over with text, with imagery, with video, with music. The kind of data is very general. Any kind of data, even geospatial, you can do this with. And so anything where there's a huge repository of sorted data, like on the internet, you can get these huge generalized models. And so we're going to see this continue. Even if there was no additional algorithmic innovation at all, which there will be, you would see this continue and improve for several years purely on what we know right now. So how do we think about this? What do we think about when we say AI model? What is an AI model besides the lovely generated people we saw on the screen. I think I hear a lot of people try and explain this in different ways. Some people say, oh, it's just statistics. It's just autocomplete. It's just really fancy autocomplete. And I think this is a little bit like looking at a nuclear blast and saying, well, it's just a really big fire. In that, one, you're not wrong, but two, that's not helpful. So what is helpful? We could think about this in a literal way. In a literal way, an LLM is a kind of map of language. A large language model is a kind of map of language, or an image model is a kind of map of images. If you imagine a city, a map of a city, in which buildings that are close to each other are words that are similar in meaning or co-occur a lot, and words that are far from each other, buildings that are far from each other. That's a little bit like what this is. You can see on the right, this is actually literally an LLM, a very simple, small one called Word2Vec, not like the massive conglomerates, nothing like GPT-4. This is what it looks like in 3 dimensions. Of course, originally it was even this one was in 200 dimensions, and GPT-4 is in thousands of dimensions. But it gives you kind of an idea. We can't imagine that, but we can envision this. This is literally what the English language looks like. And I think that's kind of beautiful. I kind of wonder what that bulgy bit on top is. Is that Welsh, or what's going on there? And when you create these, you actually can do translation by doing this with different languages, like taking English and German, and looking where the shapes are the same and overlay them. And then people are now doing that with things as diverse as whale song, mapping the shape of whale song onto English as well. So this is one way to think of it, a map of language. But I'm not sure this is helpful either, because then you're sitting in front of a computer and it doesn't look like a map. It looks like you're typing something in. It looks like you're talking to someone. Some metaphors I've heard there that I like are a talented contractor that doesn't know anything about your context, or spell casting. It's very powerful, but requires following lots of arcane rules and can go wrong easily. But the reality is that this doesn't work exactly like anything we've seen before. It doesn't work like AI does in the movies, and it doesn't think like a person. And I think it's going to take a long time for us to really get a handle on how exactly to think about this. Because the reality is, right now, we know that they work, but we don't know how they work. No one does, not even the people making them. Doesn't mean that it's not possible to understand them. We are learning how they work. That's the field called mechanical interpretability, if you're interested in that kind of domain. And this is a little bit like what happened with early flight. When we started building airplanes, we actually did not have the analytical physics to describe why flight worked. And it wasn't decades and decades later until we really did. Some people argue that we still don't. And so you can actually get very far without this. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't use it. It doesn't mean that you can't make it safe. But we're still in very, very early days in terms of knowing at all why this is happening and how they work. Okay, so given that all this is happening, how does this apply to us? How do we want to be augmented? How do we want to take these new things, these talented contractors or these magical spells or whatever we want to think about this map, or these maps of new territories? And I think this boils down to a few questions. 1, what is your truth? 2, what is your purpose? How do you determine your truth? And how do you work towards your purpose? These sound like very philosophical questions, and they are. But in the world of generative AI, they're now very practical and actionable. And they're very hard questions. If you get this right, the AI part is actually pretty easy. This is the hard part. What is your truth and what is your purpose? Why are these important? Because they're going to help you solve a lot of problems with generative AI algorithms. So one of the big problems with generative AI is that the LLMs hallucinate. Now, Nick and I live in California, and so we know that not all hallucinations are a bad thing. But that's actually really true. But how do you identify that, and what do you believe is a hallucination? So this is from a model called Cohere. They're a contractor with, they deploy on-prem, so they get involved in a lot of kind of government contracting type things. They're really solid LLM alternative to some of the closed source competitors. And I put in Jeremy Kirshbaum is, and it said, a professor at the University of Michigan School of Information. And it talked about a lot of really amazing research that I have never done, given that I am not a professor at the University of Michigan School of Information. It's very flattering. Could have said a lot of other things, but it's not true, right? So when is this a problem, and how is this a problem? And why does what is your truth and what is your purpose matter? So this is a system we're building with an author, a distinguished fellow at a longtime partner and collaborator organization called Institute for the Future. Bob Johansen is a distinguished fellow there. He works a lot with very senior leaders at big companies, and he's been a foresight practitioner for 50 years. And he's written, I think, 12 books now. And so what he does now a lot is coaching with leaders. And so we wanted to start to automate and bring to life this practice that Bob has. So in this case, the truth was Bob's books. We had a specific corpus to work from. So if you enter a question into this system, you don't get out generic information. You get the most relevant part of Bob's books applied to the question. And then it answers not as Bob would, but in the direction that Bob would. And then we had to decide, do we want it to make stuff up? And the answer was yes. When we started out, if you asked, so Bob recently wrote a book with some co-authors called Office Shock, about the future of offices and officing, the verb for offices. And if you asked it, what will be the role of dogs in the future of offices? It would say, I don't know, because that wasn't in anywhere specifically in the books. This was frustrating to users, I guess because they had dogs, or because they had questions that they felt were relevant and they were getting I don't know answers. So we changed it. Now it will give its best interpretation. Now, in this case, the truth was Bob's books. I'm also an advisor for a group called AI and Faith. And that's a group of faith leaders and kind of CS people working together to think about how this applies to faith. I'm not personally a person of faith, but I really admire the work that they're doing and the way that they think about ethics and morality. And I can tell you that there are deep, ancient traditions around how truth is defined in these places and how you connect the text that you're reading to what you do. And so people are thinking about how do we automate that into a system. What is the source of truth in your life or in your organization? It's probably might have to do with policy, might have to do with documentation, might have to do with your family. All of these things really matter. There's no one answer to these. There's no way that a company like Anthropic or OpenAI or any of them is going to come up with the model that doesn't hallucinate, because this is ultimately very subjective. And then the next question is, what is your purpose? So this is important because the process matters. As in the next 6 months to a year, we enter a world of more agentic generative AI. Agents that do actions for us, that take multiple actions without us in the loop. This is a demo of a product that you can try out yourself called Multi-On. And it works in the browser. Working in the browser is great because all the authentications are taken care of. And in this case, the AI is trying to order a burger from a restaurant. And I've played with this quite a bit myself. I would say that so far what it's doing doesn't actually really save much time. And certainly as you get to more complex things that you'd want it to be doing in the background, it doesn't like just start doing it for you like a worker would. But I do think that in 6 months to a year it will. As more data gets collected, as they start fine-tuning it on people's users' interactions. But in a lot of cases, this is going to be learning from how you work, right? So if you're working inefficiently, congratulations, probably your agents are going to also. You're going to do 1,000 times more browsing on Reddit while you're at work. How the work gets done and the way that it gets done is now something that will be encoded and amplified into the systems that surround you, that will be contextually embedded into your systems in order to amplify both the good and potentially the bad. And so what your purpose is and what the outcomes you're working toward are critical, because very soon they're going to be embedded not into just your own work and what you're doing, but the things around you as well. Okay, these questions are hard enough to answer, but I think there's one more cautionary thing I'd like us to think about, which is how to avoid horseless carriage thinking when we're doing this. This, of course, is a picture of an early car or a horseless carriage. It looks like a carriage without any horse. And then later what we got was the car. So, I mean, the new version of this is the driverless car, which I don't think in 10 years we're going to call a driverless car. We'll call it something else. But we don't know what that is. And they probably won't look like cars today. But for now, let's use horseless carriage. And it's easy to map the kind of old paradigms onto the new technology. So I think there's two easy tricks for avoiding this with generative AI. for avoiding horseless carriage thinking, I think one is, what would happen if I multiplied this by 1,000? And then the second is, what would happen if creating something new costs nothing? So this could be good or bad. So one example might be horseless carriage. How can I make a smart natural language search for the information on my website? I think this is something you can do. It's very nice. We're doing this for a couple of clients right now. But the real question is, how can I generate a unique website for every individual user based on their needs? If you can generate the code from scratch and it costs nothing, why not do that? Horseless carriage, what happens when people try to write their proposals with AI and make mistakes? Very important question, not to trivialize it. But the real question is, what happens when every single organization can submit thousands of unique, rigorously compliant, and correct proposals for the same RFP? What happens if your policy is that you must read and review every proposal that comes in? It could break your organization. Someone could do this adversarially just for the purposes of holding you up. So I'll leave you with these questions again. How do you want to be augmented? One, what is your truth? In both a practical and a philosophical way. What is your purpose? What are you working towards? How do you work towards this for yourself and for your organization? This is where your AI, your generative AI journey should begin. Because if you get this right, actually, the AI is the easy part. Thank you.
Now we get to play a game I call Grill Jeremy. Just kidding. So I want to start with, I think, probably one of the more burning questions in the room. Which cat would play Harold Ramis?
Probably a calico.
Okay. Yeah, I would tend to agree with that.
Yeah, I think everyone would, honestly.
Yeah. Seriously, though, I do think that we ought to take a step back and answer a pretty basic question, and that is, could you expand a little bit more definitively on what generative AI is?
Right. So, I mean, most organizations have been using AI and machine learning for quite some time now. And it's super powerful and super hard to do well. And the purpose of those are fundamentally to predict based on data or describe a set of data. It's like those algorithms are complicated and powerful, but they're ultimately a descendant of like these linear regressions that we saw in high school. It's like you have a bunch of dots, and then there's a line through the middle, and the job of the line is to summarize the data to me, and then maybe the line goes farther, and that's it predicting on the data. With generative AI, the goal is actually to make more dots. The goal is to create synthetic data, to create data that didn't exist yet. And in that way, the relationship between the data and the model is a lot different. Like when we're training on the internet to create a language model, the goal isn't to like understand the distribution of the internet, nor is it to actually create internet text, because I don't know if you've ever been on this thing called the internet, but there's a lot of text you don't want to reproduce on there. And so you put a lot of work in after the fact to do this thing called fine-tuning, where you actually are skewing the model deliberately so that it only does the things you want, which you would never do with traditional machine learning. You'd always want to follow the data, and you don't do that here. So that's the difference, is one of them is built to reproduce synthetic data as opposed to predict or describe a set of data.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, I wonder, given the space that we're in and given the company that we're in here today, you showed the corner cases as an example of a place where transportation in general is using AI to do something that we really couldn't do quickly or well or cheaply before. What excites you the most in the transportation world as far as what AI might be able to do?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that, well, one, there's a lot of exciting things, in terms of what you can do with synthetic data. earlier we were talking about the difficulty of doing things like occupancy detection. And part of that is privacy because people don't want a bunch of photos taken of them. But maybe you can train the model on synthetic images. I think also that there's a lot of exciting stuff with generative AI applied to geospatial. New ways that you can take planetary data and take mapping data and analyze it in really deep qualitative ways. Not just ask questions like, where is there a building, but maybe deeper questions like which of these neighborhoods seem healthy, and actually take these kind of things that were too mushy to actually analyze before and analyze them in a quantitative way, and analyze them in an automated way.
For those of us who were here for the keynote, Jared Thorpe is let's see if I can get this right, a data artist. So he mixes data with artistry, and he was talking about a situation where he had people of different ages come and create their own maps, like how they got to school if they were younger, where they feel the safest and things like that. And I do wonder, in the world we're in today, in the mapping, in the idea of mapping and visualization, what opportunities, in addition, are where are we going to go with that? So I'm interested on that topic. What do you think the biggest barrier to adopting AI quickly and adopting it well and for the right reasons? What barriers do you think exist there?
Yeah. There's many depending on who you are and where you are. I mean, in the north of Nigeria, often in some areas, many areas of Nigeria have massive tech startups and are extremely innovative and booming and all of that kind of thing. Other parts of it, there's no electricity. And so that's a big barrier if you're trying to access generative AI, is not being able to charge your phone for 3 weeks to a month. If you're in a highly regulated industry, then maybe regulations are. But I think you're touching on a fact that connects more to the previous question about transportation, is that this actually is not gonna, this will affect work not in kind of the way that we once thought, maybe in like the 50s conception of, it'll start with the frontline workers and then it'll like go to their managers, then it'll slowly work its way up until it's like the CEO standing on top of a pile of robots. That in fact, actually, the softer parts of the organization will be automated first here. Like consultants will be automated way before many parts of infrastructure. Physical infrastructure will actually be the last part of this to really be touched. And so these things that's what's so hard, makes it so hard to think about, is that it doesn't map onto any previous narratives of work, automation, or efficiency that we had before. When your design thinking seminar is automated before your burger flipping.
Yeah. Interesting. One of the things that you brought up, and you and I had a conversation about this, is around the idea of rules and the use of AI. And I think that was baked into that last answer. And so I'm wondering, what are your feelings around the folks here who do create policy within their own organizations? What should they be thinking about? What should they be doing? And do I need a policy?
Yeah, you should have a policy. You should have 3 policies, actually. I think the hardest part about, this is not generative AI specific, I don't think, but it's part of generative AI. The hard part here is not only creating no's in the policy, but also yeses. So a lot of groups want to get out in front of this, and so they create policies that highlight the risks really clearly. Don't put IP into the model. Make sure you don't use any personally identifiable data. We commit to not replacing any people. Don't replace any people's jobs when you use this. And all these things are really important. But people look at it, and so then they either just decide, okay, well, I'm not going to use it because I think I'm going to do it wrong, or they actually do it, but they do it secretly. And either way, the organization loses because you aren't getting the learnings, the grassroots learnings of people figuring this out. Like I said, no one knows how to use this yet. There's not a way to use this that exists somewhere that we're teaching people. We're all making this up because it's moving so quickly. And so the only way to really build a muscle around this is to give people yes zones. Do this. Don't do it for this, but do it for this kind of report. Try and use it in this way. And when you do it, share it on this platform. And we'll give you an AI champion badge or something that's meaningful in your organization. And by doing that, you will benefit from the learnings of people. But this happens with technologies a lot, with shadow IT. And I remember you were telling a story actually about when this happened for you and when social media was first kind of entering organizations.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of the reaction to anything shadow, whether it was shadow IT, and by the way, shadow IT is the idea that there's a group that's not IT, that's not sanctioning the technology, that's out doing something else. And the story that Jeremy's referring to was it was a product called Yammer. It was a Microsoft product that's still kind of around in the background, but it was a social media tool for the workplace. It was like Facebook for professionals inside of a walled garden in your organization. And I was brand new at the time, running IT, internal IT for the organization, and someone had stood up a Yammer site and didn't ask IT. And my staff came to me and they said, "We got to shut this down." And I said, let's not do that. I said, why don't we, instead of doing that, I said, why don't we look at it as something for assessment purposes, decide if it's good, work with the people that brought it in, the staff that brought it in, and if we like it, we'll use it. And we did like it, and it worked well for quite a while. It's been kind of supplanted by a number of other tools, I mean, Teams, of course. But that really started how we handled shadow. We just said, forget it, shadow's okay, under one condition, you tell us what you're doing. And because, I mean, at the end of the day, IT is going to figure out what you're doing, right? They're going to figure out where your IP addresses are going and things like that. There's ways. So instead of hiding behind that and doing things in the shadows, let people actually do it and report out on it. And what I want to know on this topic is there's kind of two things, and we'll get back to transportation in a minute, but there's two things that people seem to be doing, right? There's ChatGPT, which is open on the internet. You create yourself a little login with whatever account you use, your spam account or whatever, and you go ask it questions, and it does great things. I mean, it can write a job description in about 7 seconds. It can write interview questions for you. Not that I've ever done any of these things in the last 2 weeks. Like, it can do all these things for you. It can write emails to all staff. I would never do that, of course. But it does all these great things, and it saves you a ton of time. So that's a thing. And then there's the walled garden approach. Companies out there, big tech companies that probably provide your email and calendar and your office products. Companies like that have a walled garden. As an organization, what do you think we should be doing? Should we do ChatGPT, or we're going to give you a walled garden? What do you do with that?
Yeah. So I think it's really about, this is actually easier than you think, because the answer has a lot to do with all the things that we've had to learn with cloud or any other kind of data analytics. There's nothing inherent about the models that collect data. The models themselves don't collect data. And at the time of training, they're frozen. So what this means is that the company offering it can collect the data, but if their terms of service say that they don't, and you have an MSA with them and they're compliant, then there's no reason why you should be any more worried about an AI company or an AI service than you should be about cloud storage. And so the answer to this really has to do with what your company does around vendors, digital vendors already. with some companies, like pharmaceutical companies, they do everything on-prem. They are super IP-driven. They don't want anyone touching it. They don't want any of, the big tech players touching it. And so they do make their own cloud storage. And so they are making their own AI models. DoD, folks like this, they're, for a lot of reasons, doing that as well. Well, if your organization is already, purchasing cloud storage, is already comfortable working with tech vendors, and you have a set of rules around privacy and IP and what you need in a contract in order to do that, you can easily map that over to AI. And I think there's generally over-cautiousness in this regard, which isn't a bad way to start out, but I think that it will soon seem pretty pedestrian.
Okay. Interesting. So one thing that's interesting about Jeremy is he probably lives about 10 miles from my house. And no, we didn't know each other before this. But that means that he's familiar with the landscape of the San Francisco Bay Area. And the Bay Area Toll Authority has 7 state-owned bridges that are tolled, not the Golden Gate Bridge, by the way. And also, we have a series of express lanes that's continuing to be built out. And I wonder, because I'm sure, Jeremy, you've witnessed the toll booths, or the toll plazas rather, and driven on the roads with the express lanes. Do you see when you're driving on them, do you see opportunities there? When you're stuck in the lanes trying to get on the Bay Bridge, do you think about that?
Yeah.
The answer is yes, please.
Yeah. I mean, in really bad traffic, it'd be nice to have, speakers that sing me a customized song as I pass by. I think a lot of this stuff is going to be around back office work. I think, like I said, physical infrastructure is going to be kind of the last thing that this touches. And I think that the things that get eaten away first are things around text, around imagery, around media. And so I think that a lot of the work that we do engaging with communities, around engaging with each other, around where roads get built, around how we manage vehicles, how we do all of that stuff, is going to be touched by this earlier than actually changing my experience of driving in the expressway.
So I think this will be fun. How many people in here are vendors? How many, little plug here, how many folks that are vendors have been doing AI longer than AI's been a thing? Like before 7 months ago. Okay. So what I'm curious about, and I come from an IT background, is AI and ML were the big topics in the Gartner research about 7 or 8 years ago. Everything, it was a joke in IT. Everything's either AI or ML. That's where we're going. And everybody just kind of nodded their head, and a lot of vendors said we're doing it. Big name tech vendors said we're doing it. And all of a sudden, ChatGPT comes out. And now grandma is finding, ways to make new recipes with ChatGPT, and little Timmy's having it write his essays for him. And now there's this huge interest. What happened?
Well, we had this big advancement of the transformer algorithms, which are very general, like the same model can do a lot of different things. It can write the essay and do the recipe. Also, it works with natural language. So before we had to, if we were doing AI and ML, ultimately it had to be boiled down to like numbers or categories or something. You don't really have to do that anymore. And so if you have 100,000 surveys, you don't have to just mark how many people answered each one. You can actually get really qualitative results. The way that if you had 10 surveys of someone writing out in natural language what they thought, one person could sit down and read that, and the insights they got out of it wouldn't be 5 people said this and 2 people said this. They'd be able to describe to you in a nuanced, analytical way in natural language. And so you can do that at scale now. I think also it's very novel and it's new. And we generally tend to call things AI when they don't work. And as soon as they start working, they go away and they're just whatever they are. Like it's AI and ML as long as the like images are wrong, and then as soon as it starts working, it's like, oh, it's just charging me for a toll. Or we were using the example earlier. You wouldn't call a car like an internal combustion technology. I don't think Uber would identify as a cloud computing company. If someone was describing it like a car to you and said, oh, well, you take chemical energy and you compress it thousands of times a second, and you use that to convert it into kinetic energy in order to optimize your logistics. You'd say, I don't know what a car is, but it sounds really dangerous, and I'm not going near it. But no, you ask me what a car is, and I say you drive it, use a steering wheel. And so I think that's also why it's getting so much attention right now is because of the rough edges. And I think that it will go away in a few years, not because it stops working, but because it gets more useful. And then you won't call it ChatGPT, you'll call it the essay writer. You won't call it ChatGPT, you'll call it the recipe book.
Cars are dangerous. Let's make sure that we've got that. What do you see opportunities in the world of safety when it comes to optimized logistics, aka driving?
Sure. There's huge power for this stuff in simulations of all kinds, including for training. I think for video, it's a little bit early, but there's all kinds of risks in the world. There's risks in HR. And actually giving people real generated personalized scenarios that they haven't seen before that they can interact with in real time, so that when they confront a real difficult conversation, they're able to do that. That technology exists today. And there might be vendors for it, or you could build it yourself with not too much effort. In terms of training for people how to drive, and then also, of course, as we move into different increasing levels of automation, producing better data so that that training can happen more safely, and you can ensure that both to test automated systems and to train automated systems. But the flip side of this, of course, is that anytime you get an increase in the safety capability, you get an increase in the adversarial capability as well. So if you get better at detecting license plates, it gets easier and easier for people to fool the detector. If you get better at creating robust training data, it gets easier for people to create situations in which they can trick it. So there's always nuance and complexity, and unfortunately, bad actors, often have the same tools as we do.
Great point, and I think that's a good place to ask another question, and we're going to go down the dubious road for a minute. What is the biggest threat to the population in general from AI? Do you see one? Do you see any?
Oh yeah, definitely. I'm really worried about it. I think that there's a few things that are concerning. One is just if it does, it might not happen as fast as we think it would. Even sometimes things move slower than we think. But if it does displace a lot of people's work really quickly, people will often say, oh, well, we've had new technologies before, and what happens is some jobs get automated and new ones get created. And that may be true, but even if you have insurance on your house, you don't want it to burn down. Like, if someone comes to you and says, oh, you're like, my house burned down, you say, oh, well, you'll get a new house. What are you worried about? Like, having to displace and change really quickly can be really troubling, and especially if that happens to a lot of folks. I don't know that would happen, but I think that's a real risk. I also think misinformation is a really, really big risk. I mean, misinformation already is a problem, and this is just going to make it so much worse. You can't. There's no way to identify if someone is trying to not be obvious about it, what text is generated. There's no way to identify what images are generated. And video, you can't identify, especially where people see it on social media. Like, the videos are like this big. Like, you're not going to notice if someone's hand is a little blurry. So the ability to trust information is going to get really difficult, to the extent that I think that in-person conversation will like become really at a premium, because that's how you'll really know people are who they say they are. Yeah, I think those are the two big ones that come to mind. I think also just right now the algorithms don't know who we are, and people kind of already get addicted to social media and stuff. And so I think that there's a risk of just like, if they are generating it for us in a way that's highly personalized, it being really hard to look away and people spending too much time on it. But also on a more kind of practical organizational way, those are more like societal or philosophical. I think cybersecurity is already really hard. It's about to get so much harder. The ability to create really, really nuanced automated spear phishing attacks against people is just unimaginable. Taking like an amount of information, creating really realistic communications. I mean, you know from your background that people in organizations, they just always download the PDF. They, no matter how silly the email looks, eventually someone downloads it and then it's a problem. Those emails are going to get super nuanced, and the ability for people to quickly tell whether it's actually someone in the organization in the Slack chat or the team's actually talking to them or a bad actor, is going to be tough. So, and then there's a lot of papers coming out about how much easier it is to jailbreak LLMs than it is to protect against that. So ultimately, the intelligence of the systems makes them vulnerable. It's kind of
Jailbreak what?
like you try and make your model really robust to only do things that you want it to. Okay. It's kind of like provably possible to always unlock that. So for now, you don't want smart systems guarding things that are important. It's kind of like if you're hiring a bouncer. I don't mean to pigeonhole bouncers. I'm sure there are many very intelligent bouncers, but that's not what you're hiring them on. You want your bouncer to follow very specific instructions and to do it every time. And the more that they're thinking about it and wiggling, the more room there is for mistakes. So have something dumb, guard the important things, and let the LLM do stuff that's more on the outside.
Yeah. I guess I would put a pitch out here. This is my information security hat for a second, and that is if there are executives out there and you're not having conversations with your IT group about cybersecurity and you're not sticking your nose in, I'd suggest you do. We find it very important to have information security, a conversation on a quarterly basis with our entire executive team. So little pitch there. I think it's really important. I want to delve into something a little bit different because I think it's going to hit this group pretty well because it's something that we all deal with. And then after this, we're going to go out and see what questions you all have. Jeremy and I had lunch and we talked about governance. And there are multiple levels of governance, right? There's policy, in your organization. There's general policy around it. But from a governmental policy perspective, what do you think we need? What do you think whether it's the toll authority, whether it's the state, whether it's the country, what do we need in this area?
Well, I think what we need right now actually is to not regulate too quickly, but I think that convening power is really important. I think that, I work a lot in China, and they absolutely have the most advanced regulations in the world around this. And Europe isn't far behind. One of those governments is very centralized, and another one is very decentralized, and both of them have moved very quickly on this. But I think it's actually important for regulation to be the outcome of a societal conversation. I think there's a lot of deep questions to answer here, around like copyright or policy or like what is okay to say in public with AI, what's okay to not have a human in the loop. I don't think these are obvious, and I don't think applying old regulations to the new thing is going to work a lot of the time. And I think I would, if I was a government agency in the US, I would hope that they are asking a lot of questions and trying to find out, create opportunities for people to actually dialogue and companies to interact with each other. I really like seeing industry associations organize around this, not because I am actually at all anti-regulation. And often the companies are also not, right? If you get clear regulations, then you really limit your own liability. But if you do that too quickly, then you're kind of enforcing it onto people instead of crafting it around what people want to do with it, and it's just moving too quickly. I think the risk would be moving too quickly and distorting what people are trying to do with it, or getting in the way, and creating something that's like not possible to be followed or things like that.
Great. I think this is a good point. What I'd like to do now, I have to believe there's some questions out in the audience, and appreciate you bearing with us through the conversation. Went a lot of different places. There's a lot going on. So we've got a couple of mics set up. I'm going to point, like you can actually tell where I'm pointing, but there's one over here and one over here. So folks, if you have a question, don't be shy.
Fascinating conversation. Thank you, Jeremy. Given that the models require a lot of data, and we know that there are lots of parts of the world that there's very little data about, what are your thoughts about bias and not really having the right answers when you're missing a lot of data about people of the world? So, any thoughts about that?
Yeah, definitely. So I think it's not possible to get rid of bias. All models are biased, and that's the point. You do want to try and get your biases from implicit to explicit and from accidental to on purpose. There's interesting work with things like low resource languages. One group worth calling out is the Equiano Institute that works on this, trying to take LLMs and adapt them to languages with less data on the internet. And I think that's the danger of looking to the companies for this kind of one model that rules it all. And that's what's exciting also about smaller models and open source models. I think this is also like a big plug for me around open source, is that that then enables people to take the models, if they have the electricity and they have the internet and they have the compute, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and start to play with them themselves and adapt them in the way that they want. But we really are working, from a disadvantage, given that so much of the internet is English and American. But there are people doing really cool innovation around this. There's the pattern that you want to get to it, whether that's, you might speak, a small language that's not well represented, or maybe you're dealing with a kind of computer code that doesn't have a lot of representation on the internet. I'm working with a friend around G code for CNCs, and the models are very good at Python and JavaScript, but they're not very good at this, for instance.
Tell us what CNCs are.
It's like computer-aided manufacturing. You can like carve you a chair or something, depending on how big it is. The point being that you want to you find some small data set and fine-tune a model on it, and then get it out to users as quickly as you can to start getting data. So for low-resource languages, often the initial data set is actually a translation of the Bible, because the Bible exists in pretty much every language, and it's just enough to train a translator algorithm to be just good enough that people will start using it, and then you can start bootstrapping and improving as people use it. So think about that. What's that initial data set you can gather? And what's the first thing you can get out to users so they'll start using it, and you can start improving as you go?
Thanks for the question. Yep, next over here.
Howdy, thanks for the presentation. I think that, this being the tolling industry, there's probably a lot of interest in kind of this customer service. You kind of get your general, I'd like to access my account. It seems very valuable for that sort of thing. I've played a lot with these tools and haven't seen one that hasn't hallucinated yet. Mm-hmm. How do you kind of approach that for this sort of customer service thing, and how do you keep somebody from suing you, I guess, at the end of the day?
Yeah, the kind of the state of the art right now for preventing hallucination is basically attaching it to search. So the word for this is retrieval augmented generation, or RAG. But really what you're doing is just, instead of going straight to generating, you have your source of truth. What's your truth? So in this case, it would be facts about your products and things like that. And then before you generate something, you search for the relevant thing and try and pull that into the model. Now this is really hard. Search is not a new problem, but it is a hard problem. And there's a lot of nuance to it. But that's essentially how you would do it, is with what's called retrieval augmentation.
Thanks for that question.
One nuance on that. Right now, what I would suggest you start working on today is anything that involves natural language. So if it's customer service queries and the documentation is natural language, great. Anything that involves a natural language to quantitative handoff, so it's like I have an Excel sheet, or I have a bunch of tabular data, or I have a SQL database, and I want to be able to type in natural language and get something out of that. That is almost there, and it's possible under certain circumstances, but it's really not quite good enough. One, because it's just less reliable in general, because there's multiple steps. But two, because the precision for quantitative analysis is just much higher than natural language. If I wanted to write a blog or even give me a customer service answer and it's 95% correct, that's probably still useful. A calculator that's only right 95% of the time or is 95% correct is 100% useless. So I would wait at least 6 months to a year before you start diving into that in a production setting.
Cool.
Yeah.
You started the conversation talking about what is your truth, and I guess I'm more concerned about what is the truth. And one, you used the example of Jeremy Kirshbaum as a professor at some university. You're not a professor at that university, right?
Not that I know of.
So you talked about giving your model that you were working on permission to just make stuff up. So all of a sudden, as a result of that query, this piece of now data exists that says Jeremy Kirshbaum is a professor at the University of Michigan.
Right.
That's not true. But in the response to some other query, who is Jeremy Kirshbaum, all of a sudden, it generates yet another query that says you're a professor, and pretty soon you are a professor. In other words, how do we preserve the truth, not just my truth?
Right. I guess I think what the truth is just kind of caps out pretty quickly. I think there's maybe you want to define the truth as scientific truth, but even in the scientific community, there's a lot of disagreement on many different topics. So I don't really know what we would mean by the truth. I think you're pointing out that maybe there are things that are definitely not the truth, and definitely not anyone's truth. And how do we weed those out? And I think that ultimately these still just aren't AI questions. If you want your model to not hallucinate, you need to connect it to other systems. So AI models don't adhere to any particular truth. You can get them there, but you want to hook it out to something that you do trust, some kind of outside database that you've reviewed that you do trust, and pull that in procedurally. Some people hook them up to the internet, which is fine, just that's as reliable as the internet is, and then it's only as good as your internet search. With the Foresight Coach, we know that we like what's in Bob's books, and we generally want people to hear about that. And so we limit its answers. In that case, we started by limiting it exclusively to what was in the books, and then opened it up slowly, trying to make it loyal to the books. And this is a question that might come up if you're, like, with 85% of the Earth identifies as religious and growing. So for those people, at least part of their truth involves a religious belief or text. And so that would be involved. But religious texts are very short. They don't say usually directly what you should do in every single situation throughout the day. And so you have traditions of interpretation around that. That's just as true in law and policy as it is in religion. So what is your truth in a textual way? Where do you put that? You connect that up to your model. And then what is your process of working with that truth are the two questions. And that is the same in a world of misinformation as not. And once you have that, there are methods for adhering to that in generative AI. It's just really hard to define what that is.
I think my brain is going to burst after that. That was great. It was very deep, though. Oh, we got more questions.
Yeah.
All right.
Hi, Jeremy. Thank you for the very insightful presentation here. Early on in the presentation, you showed us video of synthetic data being generated to help train models. Mm-hmm. There's been a lot of research coming out in the last few months that generative AI, training AI, can lead to quite catastrophic model collapse, essentially. It gets so integrated with error that the error builds over time and the model becomes useless, particularly to humans. So on that note, and talking about truth, how do you see humans in the loop playing out in the future, and how critical humans are going to be to maintaining bias, managing truth in AI? So I just wanted to get your thoughts on model collapse and how you see humans playing into that. And obviously here in transportation, we serve a lot of humans, but we also have a lot of humans serving those humans. So just seeing how you see that future playing out. Thank you.
I think there's a few facets to that question. One, I'm very pro-human. I actually identify as a human myself, and so I'm very optimistic about our continued relevance. I think that the ability for models to learn from each other depends a lot on how you set it up. My understanding of that model collapse research was actually like taking generations from a model and feeding it like back into the same model to retrain it again, which I think is much different than how you would actually do it, or what would happen if you had a bunch of text on the internet that people were interacting with before you fed it back in. So there's as many examples of synthetic data being used to improve models as leading to difficulty. I think that on the human side, there's a big question mark there because we don't actually have a lot of experience collaborating around AI-generated information yet. So we don't have a Google Docs for generative AI text. We don't have a Wikipedia. We don't have a Reddit. We don't have a GitHub. And of course, this is just horseless carriage thinking. I'm not actually implying that there's going to be a one-to-one of any of those. But even in organizations, there's not usually like a place where if you figure out a good prompt that works, that you can go share that with people. You know, you're like taking a screenshot and posting on your LinkedIn or something. And so how we actually collaborate with each other while using these tools, I think is a big open question. Will have will be the defining impact on how ultimately, what our role is in jobs that's new. Because right now we're all just like in our own little ChatGPT history thread, when only we see the history and no one else sees it. And that's just not how work works. That's not into 2023. That's not how we do anything. So I think that's going to fade pretty quickly. And we'll make that question a lot more clear.
Cool, thanks. I think we're going to do one more question here, and I bet it's going to be a grillin'.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Jeremy, for this such important topic. I'm Rafael Hernandez, IntelliRoad. I'm a believer that, I believe there is no free lunch. So I don't pay for my Google email account, so therefore I believe they're reading every single communication that come across my Gmail account. And considering AI and machine learning to be either automating tasks or predicting an outcome, it's very convenient to me when my cell phone tells me, oh, it is time to leave to the airport because it's raining and there is a lot of congestion on the road. Is privacy something that we should be really concerned, or it is something that is being, over or dramatically exaggerated, with these privacy concerns and stuff?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know that it's only an AI question. I face I'm philosophically pro-privacy, but also have to work in 2023. And it's like, at the end of the day, it's like, okay, fine, just take it, whatever it is. Like, let me get into the thing. Like it wears you down, and ultimately, it just seems like so many entities have so much of my data. Where this will hit the rubber will hit the road with generative AI is right now when you're interacting with the models, if you want them to know something about yourself, you have to tell them every single time. And you have to tell them directly. You're this and I'm doing this, and here's all the information about it, and here's how you should do this, here's how you should do this. And people are already working on, and they're getting much better, contextually and programmatically doing that on the back end. If you give it access to your calendar, you don't have to tell it what your calendar is. If you give it access to your emails, you don't have to have it guess how to write the emails based on other people's emails, or like it'll then know who other people are. So it'll make your prompting a lot more contextually rich. And the more access you give it to different kinds of data, the more it will seem personalized to you and will be personalized to you and will hallucinate less because it will know what the answer is ahead of time. And in return for that, some company will then have all the data. So I think it is, in some ways, the same problem that applies to a lot of these services, but you're on the right track that it's going to be especially relevant for these tools too, because ultimately, we want them embedded into our context because it relieves us of work of having to like constantly reiterate what that is and get it right each time. So if you do care about privacy, start strengthening your will now, because it's going to get harder and harder to maintain that.
I do want to end and ask if you could give this room some advice. It's clear that things are changing, and this thing, generative AI, is going to be just a part of how we do business. What skills should we be hiring for?
Yeah. Yeah, I think expository writing is actually something that will make a comeback. A lot of crafting these prompts and things like that requires just very structured analytical prose. And this might change a bit. I think that prompting will diverge from prompt engineering, will diverge from prompt science, and you will get stuff that looks kind of like weird gobbledygook computer things for hyper efficiently doing things with these models. But a lot of this day-to-day stuff is like, I have a brand personality that someone wrote for me, or I have a policy. And right now, it's written in a certain way, but it needs to be written in a way that I can easily embed it into all of our content writing. Or I need to get the system to do something. A lot of this is just really clearly articulating what you want. And the people that are really good at that are good writers. I think there's also this kind of weird in-between set of roles of people that understand natural language really clearly, understand more qualitative business processes, but then also understand some amount of the technical system. Because a lot of technical people don't actually have not spent their time learning about how language works, because they're focusing on other things. So if you have a system that takes a set of information and then summarizes it and then changes the style of the summary and then adds some information about the user and they get something at the end, you need someone that understands what is a good summary. This is a hard question. What should go into a summary? Then someone that understands what a good piece of writing, a readable piece of writing looks like to guide the model to do that. And then understand how that gets interfaced with like what the user would want to hear about themselves. And how that happens, you need someone who understands some of the technical system and also that. And we don't have, there's like this technical product manager type roles that might have a bit of that, but people that are in that zone, these kind of hacker types, I think will also be of increased value.
Excellent. Well, we do have one more piece of business after Jeremy, but right now, please thank Jeremy. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure.
Great. Now, I would like to introduce the man with a voice as smooth as Bob Uecker, Pat Jones.
Front row. Yeah, thank you, Nick, and thank you, Jeremy, for an excellent conversation. I learned a lot. I want to remind everybody that the IBTTA annual reception and banquet is here in the Convention Center beginning at 6:30 p.m. The reception will be right out there in the foyer behind me, and we'll open the doors for the dinner at 7 p.m. We'll have a couple of speeches, and there will be some entertainment, and it may not be what you think it is. So come on back at 6:30, and we look forward to seeing you at the reception and dinner. Thank you.